Most people hold the observation that the goal of science is to gain more and more knowledge, which is somewhat true but not in the usual context, where each individual science just generates qualitative or quantitative data about a subject. In order to describe something, strong relationships between different levels and categories must be made. Questions such as how is the molecular structure of a cell connected to the vast diversity we see in species around ecosystems? Why do we get different results when we look at different scales of the universe? Or why an ant's body is shaped in this exact shape for the functioning of the colony as a whole? We try to answer these questions by making a bunch of observations, which we try to formalize so that they can be used as the standardized building blocks for the next hypothesis. But the more we try to formalize abstract questions, the more disagreement we see. And exactly fundamental forces such as life and mathematics are the ones that disturb specialists the most. Just for life, there are more than 100 definitions. The distinction between levels of the universe is blurry. Until very recently, the only way we looked at these levels was in terms of description of content. We see an animal and we try to find the best way to describe it. There are cells, which are the basic unit of life. Those cells are made of molecules, which are made of atoms, which are made of protons, electrons and neutrons, which are made of quarks. This might be correct, but it doesn't give us a whole description of the animal we wanted to study in the first place. We cannot understand the cell just by identifying the parts it is made of. The universe is dynamic, and this constant chain of events eliminates the possibility of finding the essence of something without considering how it develops in time. You have to find how those molecules interact, what kind of rules guide their behavior. So, usually when we collect all the parts and unravel the mechanism behind their action, we would consider this a working and useful description. On the other hand, in the abstract language of philosophy and metaphysics, you want to understand the essence of objects and phenomena. In other words, what does it mean for something to be alive? Or, for example, what is the ontological relation of good and evil with reality? Many years had to pass for the distinction between parts and essence to come to the spotlight. The first person to try to describe this differentiation was G.H. Lewis. He coined the term emergence, which has Latin roots in the Latin word for something to rise up. Why exactly for something to rise up? He made the observation that there are things that you can calculate or understand by summing up the things they are made of. Such a thing is the weight of something. You can calculate the weight of something by adding the weights of all the parts that it is made of. Therefore, the weight is a resultant effect, because it is the result of the sum of its parts. But what about life, or mind? with terms like that, the latter approach can't give us a satisfying result. Those things are emergent results, meaning that they are qualitatively novel compared to the causes they emerge from. For example, your brain can think and navigate a complex net of emotions and beliefs, but we don't see those qualities in the neurons. The same way, given the right conditions and interactions, a bunch of molecules can organize into something alive. But that wouldn't change the fact that none of them are individually alive. Lewis characterized emergence as something with great relevance in the unification of science. He said, "This is about the relation between an entity and its parts." But maybe the greatest consequence from the idea is that it challenges reductionism on a very fundamental level, reducing objects and phenomena to other objects and phenomena is the way science usually operates. Reductionists believe that the path to understanding is reducing stuff until we reach the most fundamental and irreducible part. And then, if we understand the smallest unit, we will understand the thing as a whole. This implies that everything can be understood by analyzing its parts. A reductionist might see a mathematical concept and reduce it to logic or set theory, for example. All the hype about emergence took a downfall when in the 20th century, great scientific advancements such as molecular biology seemingly shed a light on controversial questions. However, a few decades later, emergence theory started gaining popularity again and indoctrinated itself as part of cognitive science, social science, and complex system theory. If someone wanted to adopt an emergentist view on reality, they would have to consider not only levels of scale and organization, but also causality. It is intuitive to think that the direction of causality would be proportional to the scale. That is, when small fundamental levels cause the behavior of higher levels that contain them. Fundamental forces drive the smallest things, which drive the bigger things. Simplicity causes complexity. But even this stable view can be reasonably challenged. The concept of downwards causality introduces the mechanism of macroscopic scales influencing microscopic scales. For example, in neuroscience, it is generally accepted that neurons act and that action creates our mind. This is a straight one-directional causation. At the same time, some scientists look at the possibility of reverse or bidirectional causation. That is, when higher levels of organization influence the lower ones, such as our subjective mind not being a consequence from, but the reason for how neurons act. An emotional state can have permanent impact on the way neurons are wired. But at the same time, this state appeared in the first place because of how neurons were wired. This, of course, is just a speculation with many counter-arguments. For example, downward causation might be illusionary, because the causal effects are never direct, but always first propagating through the environment. In this rebuttal, neurons want to execute a certain higher level function. And if that fails, the environment signals the sensing organs, and the neurons are wired to accommodate the conditions. And though compelling, this argument doesn't, in my opinion, take into account the strangeness of the universe we live in. You can't reduce mental phenomena to mechanisms of simple feedback loops. There is obviously something distinct between a set of physical mechanisms and feedback system with perception and cognition. That thing is subjectivity. Of course, it is obvious that mental phenomena have their roots deep into neural or at least some sort of substrate. For software to exist, as far as we know, there must also be hardware components to support the computation. But while non-conscious system can evolve and change, there is no other driver of that action than the starting conditions and environment. At the same time, with systems such as us, the living creatures, there is a sort of entity that experiences the interaction between the collection of cells that define the boundaries of your body and everything else. That entity is the you, the self, which qualifies quantitative data. This subjectivity of mind is about seeing things that are not actually there. The labels we put on the world define our cognition and decision making. When consciousness arose for the first time, it is, in my opinion, that the most fundamental characteristic it had was the ability to differentiate or to create arbitrary boundaries. And it is actually ironic to think how life emerged as a bunch of molecules which organized into a system and compacted themselves in their own enclosed environment, that is the membrane. So now we have a bunch of non-living things that enclose themselves, guided by chemical laws. This is the very first step for the self to emerge. The simplest life must be defined by the idea that it is something rather than everything. I am something because I am not other things, which fits wonderfully with Hegel's views on reality. So now that the molecules are arranged, it is vital to analyze them in the domain of time. For any event to occur, change must be generated. But what is peculiar about change is that it always comes at a price. The law of equivalent exchange. And in every change, the basic currency with which the universe trades is energy. If the molecules that the cell contains want to stay together as an organized system, they must battle fundamental forces that want to disrupt that. For example, if you want to keep a bunch of gas molecules confined in a particular space, you need to put constant energy in to make up for going around the laws of thermodynamics, which govern them to separate and spread equally. So to keep their organization, the molecules must find a way to gather power. So even if they want it to be a completely closed system, they are pushed to interact by their environment, where free energy just flies around. Well, it isn't really free, because the right equipment to harvest it is needed. So because it can't adapt to all energy harvesting methods, the cell specializes in energy, which the molecules can organize to harvest. That means more distinctions are made. There is the cell, and then different structures with different functions inside of it. The membrane is what interacts with the outside. It has the chemical properties to let things in and out, depending on if they would be useful for the system as a whole. And this, right here, is in my mind of great importance for the beginnings of mind. The first differentiation between me and not me happened seemingly random, with no apparent reason for this particular organization. But the differentiation between if a molecule from the outside should become part of the system or it shouldn't is one step closer to subjectivity. There is no reason for this selectivity to occur, but the particular chemical-structural organization of molecules. This chemical structure is the physical substrate of what we would call function. This function is to keep the organization, or in other words, to preserve the boundary of cell versus everything else. If we abstract that to the conceptual level of humans, we would say the cell has a will, a goal, a desire. Many philosophers have contemplated the nature of will, and some, such as Arthur Schopenhauer, even found it to be the fundamental driving force of the world. The ancient Hermetic principle, us above, so below, us below, so above, has become even more relevant to our understanding of reality. It describes the similarity between different levels of the universe. To continue with the previous topic, I must say life as a concept has a clear similarity between its parts. If we take a cell and examine its basic function, allowing it to exist, we would find simple but also fundamental mechanisms. Those are things like harvesting energy, flushing out the unneeded material, and replication. This is the below part, as cells are the building blocks. But taking things above would mean one level above the cells. That would be the multicellular organism. If we compare the two levels of life, the most important function haven't really changed, but rather moved to the next level. Cells have sensory organs, in the context that they recognize particular molecules from their environment. This happens on a low chemical level, but we also see animals using their higher level organs to detect which molecules can enter the system. A cell has specific proteins on the membrane that would only let good, unharmful ticks to enter. A dog has a nose, which would detect smells. Your brain recognizes and categorizes them as good and bad, and gives the appropriate response. You wouldn't eat disinfectant, but if we talk about organic molecules, there you have food, which you would only know is food by using your sensing organs. Then there is the disposal. Not all, but many cells have distinct structure for disposal, the same way we have the lymphatic system. Then there is replication. Cells within your body replicate when you want to replicate. At the same time, a cell doesn't have to be part of a multicellular organism to replicate. The macro replicates the micro. We can abstract even above multicellular organisms by finding out what higher entity they create. In the case of humans, we would look at societies. Society is ridiculously similar to an organism. The same way we have specialized cells to defend us against harmful components, such as viruses, a country has the military, a special defense unit. Borders, where you would have to prove you're not harmful, are the same as a sensing organ telling if something is safe to eat. Society harvests energy and creates systems to dispose of garbage. Such a system is the sewer system. When a cell wants to replicate, it would split its DNA. The DNA defines the cell. It makes it a separate entity from all the other cells. So to replicate, it will transfer this unique defining quality to another entity. The same way countries want to take territory. The equivalent of DNA in that society would be its culture. The memes that propagate and construct the minds of people who are part of this society. This comparison is only about the most fundamental functions, while a lot more functioning structures can be found. In biology, a curious phenomenon with maybe great implications are symbiotic relationships. That is, when organisms would form a strong, long-lasting relationship that usually evolves into codependency. Such a relationship is the one between animals and the enormous biome of bacteria that lives inside the body. Usually the body wouldn't want strange organisms inside of it. But in this case, stomach bacteria have become essential for digestion. While the suitable environment of the stomach not only provides shelter but also energy. Bees and flowers are in symbiotic relationship. Many times this relationship has direct impact on the evolutionary progress of the particular species. Sea animals remind of plants, but even though they spend most of their life attached to the surface of coral reefs, they are actually a predator. They have tentacles, which are wanted food by fish, as they are highly nutritious. But on their tentacles, they have cells that release toxins that paralyzes the prey and allows the animal to move it to its mouth. At the same time, clownfish uses the body of the animal for protection. We found that it secretes a substance in the mucus covering their body. This substance neutralizes the effect of the toxins from the animal, allowing it to use the tentacles as a safe habitat. So, what is it for the animal? As it turns out, it can benefit greatly from the existence of clownfish. With their bright colors, clownfish attracts predators, which the animal kills and consumes. It additionally provides nutrients from its waste, cleans the animal, and scares butterfish away, which are the primary consumers of animal. An experiment was conducted a few years ago, where researchers wanted to observe the nocturnal life of clownfish. They tracked 3 different cases. One where the clownfish and the animal were in the same tank, and one where they were separated by a mesh, allowing them to be aware of each other, and one where they were completely separated. And to put context on this experiment, you must know that animals have very little ability to move the water around. They rely on local currents for oxygen intake. In the experiment, when the animals were in the same tank, the clownfish were diving deep into the animal's tentacles, switching directions rapidly and fanning its fins. That behavior was far less frequent when they were separated. This is simply mesmerizing. The clownfish would move at night, as if it knew that the animal can't breathe properly. Moreover, a contrast is made between the behavior of the fish when it's in the presence of its symbiotic partner. It is logical to assume they are both evolving messaging systems to communicate. Well, not the same sense that you and I communicate, but this simple chemical communication means the clownfish actually evolved to react in a certain beneficial way. Actually, As it turns out, symbiosis was essential for the building of the biological world as we know it. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It generates most of the chemical energy needed by the cell to power its biochemical reactions. But even though mitochondria are classified as an organelle of eukaryotic cells, its theoretical origin story is far more peculiar. At the beginning, mitochondria existed as an individual prokaryotic cell. It was then engulfed, or in other words, immersed by either a prokaryotic or eukaryotic cell. It gradually developed endosymbiotic relationship. Endosymbiotic means one of the organisms lives inside the other ones. The mitochondria produce energy for the cell, but it still has its own separate set of DNA. The origins of chloroplasts, which allow photosynthesis, also lie in endosymbiosis. It is interesting exactly chloroplasts and mitochondria share these roots, because they are the organelles responsible for energy production, one of the most important conditions for life to continue. So the question if their function had anything to do with the symbiosis remains. Many questions about the universe on every level continue to be unanswered, but it seems to me many of them can't be answered unless we look for some sort of unification of levels, or at least acquiring a theory of the morphing of things. And no, I don't mean topology, but rather emergence. Exactly with emergence, we are never sure where something starts and another ends. Functional descriptions require us to embrace the novelty of higher hierarchical levels and never stop searching for the relationship between them.